China-Canada relations have been worse in the past, but not by much. In the wake of the RCMP detaining a top Huawei executive, we've seen trade embargoes, Canadians detained on questionable charges, and limited diplomatic progress on any of it. What will it take to change that in the coming months, particularly with a new Canadian Minister of Foreign Affairs? Let's ask. In Washington, D.C., Paul Triolo, Head of Global Technology Policy at the Eurasia Group and China Digital Economy Fellow at the think tank New America. And here in our studio, Richard Fadden, former National Security Advisor to Prime Ministers Harper and Trudeau, past Director of CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, now Senior Advisor with the Capitol Hill Group. Margaret McQuaig-Johnston, Distinguished Fellow at the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and Gregory Chin, Professor of Political Science at York University and a Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies. And we are delighted to have you three here in our studio. And Paul Triolo, good to meet you on the line from Washington, D.C. I just want to start by sharing some numbers. These are the results of a national public opinion survey done by researchers at the University of British Columbia. I'll ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring this graphic up. And for those listening on podcast, I'm going to read them all out. 58% of Canadians apparently surveyed have a negative view of China. 58%. 36% say China has become our adversary. And in regards to Meng Wanzhou, 74% say Canada is stuck in the middle between the U.S. and China. With that having been said, Richard Fadden, how would you characterize the current state of the relationship between us and them?
Well, I think, unfortunately, it's not very good at all. China, I think, is set out to change its position in the world. It's not happy with how it's viewed, and it's prepared to use virtually any method short of war to attain those goals. It doesn't play fair on trade. It has a worldwide intelligence gathering program. It plays pretty hard, as witnessed by the two Peters who are held in China.
So, the two Michaels.
The two Michaels, I beg your pardon. Right. So I would say, generally speaking, we're far from being at war, but we're also very far from just being competitors. Some people call them adversaries. I call China our strategic adversary because it's not going to go away soon.
Margaret, throughout this diplomatic battle, what do you think the Chinese state has learned about how it can treat Canada?
Well, it's learned that it can push us hard, and we're not pushing back. We've done a few things right. We've gotten some of our allies working with us to speak on behalf of Canada and Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor to try to get them out of China.
Does that include Trump?
Trump apparently has, yes, and will be doing more, apparently. This has been really helpful. We know it's been helpful because China's told us to stop. We've learned lessons ourselves, and one is that China has malevolent intent towards us.
Towards us?
Yes, towards us. We've seen it with the kidnapping of the Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. I don't like to call them the Michaels because it makes them an entity, and they're individuals going through really individual experiences. And also Robert Schellenberg, who's been given an execution sentence for a drug offense that should have had a few years, and Fan Wei, same thing.
You've heard you've heard the Chinese refer to us as, have I got the word right, Han?
Han,
what does that mean?
So Han means we're very open, straightforward, and flexible. And they say that to us as a term of friendship. They turn around and say among each other that we're Han, the same word, the same character, which means naive and gullible. And so I think one of the things we're needing to do is step up and not be so naive and be a little more forthcoming in putting forward our own positions on this challenge.
Gregory Chin, as you look at it, does it look to you like the federal government has a coherent China strategy?
No, and I think it's quite disappointing. And I think the relationship is in the worst place it's been in a long time.
What do you see missing?
Exactly what you said, a coherent strategy. I think we've been looking at a world for the last 2 decades where China has obviously been growing and evolving, becoming more powerful, as Richard Fadden said. And on the other hand, we're facing a very different United States, a Trump administration that clearly is hardening in its positioning on China. And I think we should have seen this coming on both sides. And I don't think we've adjusted well at all. Well, I'm now an outsider. I'm no longer a government official. I haven't been for over 10 years, 13, 14 years. And I'm quite concerned as, I see things from the outside now mainly. I'm not inside the Ottawa bubble, but I'm very concerned with how things have gone.
The huge question for the Canadian government at the moment, of course, will be what to do about Huawei. And to that end, Paul, I'm going to get you to comment on this first, but I'm going to read something from the Globe and Mail here, an excerpt from Canada's national newspaper, and then get you to weigh in. Here we go. The fifth generation of cellular networks, 5G, will deliver wireless connections of up to 100 times faster than 4G can support. That's the difference between an ordinary adult running and an F-22 fighter jet at top speed. The long-term effects of near-instant communication are truly unimaginable. Reducing delays from seconds to milliseconds is the key to unlocking life-saving technologies that cannot afford any lag, including autonomous vehicles and remote surgery robots that operate on patients 1,000 kilometers away. 5G enables extensive smart city networks that unify surveillance cameras, traffic sensors, electricity meters, and a near infinite collection of other Internet of Things devices, all sharing data in real time. Okay, Paul, as we indicated, Canada's got to decide whether Huawei ought to be allowed to bid on this infrastructure. The US, Australia, New Zealand have apparently banned Huawei from doing so. Half of Canadians surveyed say to be a mistake to allow them to bid on it. What sort of a threat do you believe a Huawei 5G system in Canada would pose to Canadians?
The debate has begun to center around issues like country of origin. So the question becomes, because a company like Huawei is situated in China, and because of the complicated relationship that the US now and of course Canada have with China, that therefore the trustworthiness of a vendor then is now being called into question. And Huawei happens to be the leader, one of the global leaders in 5G technology. So Huawei obviously now has become a target in the US and among other allies to ban it from 5G networks. I think the complicating issue is that there are two sides of this debate. One is that the technical solutions can be found for some of the security issues around 5G. And then the other side holds that you have to take into account that country of origin and the political and legal system in that country when you're considering the overall 5G, your posture on 5G. So I think that's where we are in this debate. And it's tough because there's no exclusive proof or definitive proof that Huawei has taken action on behalf of the Chinese government. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there. And if you talk to technical people and carriers, they in places like the UK and Germany, they believe, and even in Canada, I think one of the Canadian intelligence services believes that the technical issues can be managed. It's about risk management. So the question is, does that risk management include the country and the nature of the regime in the country? And that's sort of where we're stuck right now. And each country is making a decision around that, how to treat the country and the country of origin.
Okay, that seems like the right question to ask. So Richard, if risk management is what it's about, one of the things we need to know is how intertwined Huawei Canada, and the Chinese government, how intertwined those three things are. What do you see?
I think they're very intertwined. I mean, I think you have to start from the premise that any entity originating out of China is subject to the direction of the Communist Party. And if they issue directions to Huawei or Huawei Canada, directly or indirectly, I think they'll be followed. But to the point that Paul just made, I'd just like to add a slight twist to things. I think it's feasible that today our experts could take Huawei 5G equipment and render it impervious to Chinese intelligence assaults. The problem that worries me is that give the Chinese 5 years and they'll find a way around it. So I'm rather more in favor of preventative medicine than curative medicine. I know there are different views on this, but the Chinese intelligence services have proven themselves to be very sophisticated, very technically oriented, and Chinese law is very clear. If they want a Chinese company to intervene on their behalf anywhere in the world, they have the legal obligation to do so. And to put it in context, you'll remember that a few years ago, American subsidiaries were forbidden to trade with Cuba. So if a country as benign as the United States can force its subsidiaries to do what it wishes to do, imagine what subsidiaries of a Chinese company would do.
Margaret, follow up by I have the quote here of what the law says. The Chinese statute clearly says, as it relates to Chinese companies, they must, quote, support, cooperate with, and collaborate in national intelligence work. Does that suggest to you that if Huawei finds something out about Canada that would be helpful to the authoritarian government, they got to do it? They got to pass it along.
It does. The language is shall do it. And there's a second part to that section of the Act, and that is that they will also be obliged to keep that secret. So whatever they're doing in their intelligence work on behalf of the party, they're to keep it secret. Huawei tries to present itself as a public company, private company, privately owned. It's actually 1% owned by Meng Wanzhou's father. The other 99% is owned by trade union committee, and no one knows who's on that committee. But for sure there will be party members on it, and trade union committees report further up to a bigger trade union committee which reports to the party. So that's who owns the company.
Greg, I wonder if you could talk to us about whether you believe there's a double standard going on here. We know that there are some Silicon Valley companies, excuse me, that have close relationships with American government officials. You might even want to say that there's an interesting relationship between the government of Canada and SNC-Lavalin. Maybe not as close as some people in those two entities would like, but what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge of the current situation is we don't have a set of rules that everyone is to play by as far as the global competition in these new sectors. And what is the relationship exactly between governments and companies, the relationship between state and markets? And we know that in the case of the United States, for example, Silicon Valley received a lot of funding from the US government too, in its origins. And there's obviously relations between the two. Of course, we tend to think of the United States as a more entrepreneurial, business-driven society, and we're comfortable with that. In the case of China, it's unclear exactly what is the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government at times. And I think this is where Huawei's own position is that they're a private company, but we know, as others have said here, that there are relations between the Chinese government and these large Chinese companies, and so it's very murky what exactly is. But I think part of the challenge here, Steve, is that we're kind of making it up as we go, and there's a lot of competition between these companies, whether it's the Chinese and now the Americans are concerned, whether it's AI, fintech, in these areas of 5G, that the Chinese are getting quite far out ahead. And, so I think we're dealing with a situation where more and more of this technology discussion is being nationalized, techno-nationalism, and being used as part of interstate competition.
Well, let me follow up.
I think that does cloud things.
Let me follow up with Richard on that, because I was talking to a guy with good links to the technology companies of this country who said, I'm less concerned about Huawei having access to our data than Zuckerberg having it. You're smiling, but does he have a point?
I think he does. I don't think society generally has come to grips with the management of information and data. We are progressing so quickly technologically that policy and law is falling behind. I'm not particularly keen on having Zuckerberg being able to do anything he wants with our data, but on the other hand, I don't attribute to him ill intent down to the nth degree. I come back to the view that China, generally speaking, in terms of promoting its strategic sectors, and technology in the context of Huawei is a technical sector. They will do virtually anything to advance it. I don't think friend Zuckerberg will do that. And one of the other problems is it's not just a national security issue. I think it's also an economic issue. There's no even playing field between Canadian companies or Western companies in China. They steal any IP they can get their hands on. They receive massive support from the Chinese government, which they do not admit. The difference between the cases of the United States or Canada, by and large, we'll admit it. We help a private sector company. So the playing field is very uneven, made worse by the fact that while there are many players in the West who are not, like Caesar's wife, they are nothing compared to the ill intent of those in China who wish to advance China's position technologically.
Let me follow up with Paul on that. Paul, when governments around the world decide what kinds of technology companies they want to do business with, do you believe they should take into account the political system of the country that they intend to do business or that they're considering doing business with?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think, we've had basically 30 years of very not totally apolitical, but basically the politics haven't been involved. And so we've had supply chains, for example, optimizing around the world, and a lot of those have ended up in China. And so now, particularly over the last 2 years, with all the furor around 5G and all those great things that were mentioned earlier in that clip on 5G, there's growing concern that bigger amounts of data, in particular, I think data is really the issue here, is data on critical infrastructure, on a whole range of government activities, is all going to be floating around on 5G networks. And so that's that's contributed to this techno-nationalism, which is now you really care about who builds your network in a way that, does anybody remember fear over who built the 4G LTE networks? Nobody really cared at a time when maybe you were just doing text messages or you were doing some video or pictures. Now, because the amount of data is going to be greater, all of a sudden everybody's caring about who builds the equipment. The problem is that the industry has evolved in a certain way, and China is, for good or for evil, is at the center of a lot of supply chains around technology. And so the challenge then is, how do you untangle those in a way that makes sense, and how do you not disrupt innovation in the industry across the board, and things like semiconductors, for example, and how do you get to a point where you can trust equipment and also take into account the country of origin, but come up with a technical way. This is what the industry wants, where you're still relying on laws and regulations and compliance, and not getting into the political and ethical issues around technology, because otherwise it's a very different world that we're going to be in.
Margaret, we are part of an intelligence sharing alliance called the Five Eyes.
Yes.
Canada, U.S., Australia, New Zealand, Britain. Do you think if Huawei were involved in the 5G network in Canada, that there would be security concerns around Five Eyes?
I think there would absolutely be concern, and you just can imagine if there's a sixth eye looking in, watching of all of our communications, that there will be a real reticence to share with Canada if we had that Huawei equipment. I'd also point out that there isn't reciprocity between China and Canada and China and other countries in terms of the way our IT companies are treated. In China, there's something called the negative list, which is more than 40 sectors where foreign investment is either restricted or prohibited. And in information technologies, companies from outside China are restricted to being in a partnership with a Chinese partner who controls the relationship. Whereas they want to come into Canada and have their equipment everywhere in our country unlimited, and yet it's a state-owned company. So that's a concern as well. Also point out that in Xinjiang, Huawei is working very closely with the security agencies there, providing them with equipment and helping them with their monitoring of the Uyghur population. And even the supplier of voice recognition technology to Huawei handsets, so that the actual phones, is a company called iFlyTech. And they have been taking Uyghurs in Xinjiang and making them go through voice recognition tests where they speak and they sing and different modulations of their voice, so that when they're subsequently monitoring telephone conversations, they can see exactly who is speaking. And that's a technology that's on 1.2 billion Huawei phones.
That leads me, Gregory, to my next question for you, which is, there has been a lot of tough rhetoric about China lately, and none perhaps more so than David Mulroney, who's our former ambassador to China, who was recently quoted as having said, "China is the greatest threat to human freedom on the planet." Is he right about that?
I know David Mulroney. I worked with David Mulroney, and I think I guess I'd like to take a step back from that, Steve, and say in the last year I've been watching some of our former ambassadors and their interventions in the media, and I sometimes ask myself how constructive the comments have been.
What are you worried about?
Well, when we're dealing with this situation of 2 or 4 Canadians in a very difficult situation in Canada, and of course the Madam Meng scenario, ultimately, I think a lot of our attention needs to be focused on how do we protect these Canadians. And I don't know if the way the discussion has been handled has been very constructive or helpful.
You think we should dial down the rhetoric?
I think so.
Richard, what do you say to that?
I think there are
I disagree. I think both David Mulroney and Guy Saint-Jacques, who's another former ambassador, have been intervening publicly because they don't agree with the government's current way of dealing with China and because they think that their interventions will help.
The current way being?
Being to be relatively low-key, not take any discrete, concrete measures against China. I mean, going back to the issue of, how we should resolve this issue with Huawei, I think the basics are in the technological field. I gather the representative from Huawei told you the other day that politics shouldn't be involved. I think that's right, but policy should be involved. Our economic policy, our national security policy, and any number of other things. If I learned one thing in my last job, it was that prime ministers considered that it's their job to consider the totality of factors and events that play on particular decisions. I cannot imagine any prime minister sort of sitting there and saying, well, the technology experts tell me X and that's all I'm going to deal with. We have, people who are being detained in China. We have an unfair trade arrangement. We have China being very aggressive in acquiring IP. Of course, these things should be taken into account. They're being paid the big bucks. They get the power and the glory. They're going to have to come up with as good a solution as they can. And if I had one, I'd be on a luxury yacht in the Mediterranean right now. I don't think there's an obvious one. But saying, and I just disagree, I think all of us can make a contribution to the extent we can by talking about this a little bit and causing the Chinese maybe a little bit more than they do now to understand that we're not doing this because of American bullying. We're doing this because our national security and our national interest is at play. I favor not letting Huawei doing this. I recognize there are all sorts of complications, some of which are economic, some of which are relational, will flow if we don't let them do this. But the risk long term, if we let them in to do the 5G, we are never going to be able to get them to leave. And as I tried to say earlier, if that's the case and they can't get access to our data now, they'll find a way of doing it in the future. That's how I come out on the balance. But I think the cabinet and the prime minister eventually will have to take all of these factors into account, including the extent to which we're going to annoy the United States. I don't think we should do everything the United States tells us to do. I've never thought that. On the other hand, they're perfectly entitled to give us their view on this issue. God knows we tell them enough what we think, so that's fair. But on the other hand, that's a consideration which I think needs to be taken into account, particularly because in North America there is so much interoperability that our accepting Huawei may well be endangering their national security, let alone ours. So as I say, I put all this in a pot, and the stew that comes out is fairly toxic, and I would advise against letting Huawei in. But it's not a black and white issue, and in fact, that's one of the problems I think we're having on this file. People tend to think of it as being binary. It's not. There's a lot of gray.
Paul, I should get your, since your country was referenced there, I should get you involved at this point. There is a view among many held in Canada that Canada is in the pickle it's in right now because essentially they got bullied by Donald Trump. Do you ascribe to that view as well?
Well, we try to avoid taking positions like that. I think it's unfortunate. I think the decision, for example, to arrest Meng seems to have been taken without a very thorough discussion within the administration about the implications of that. And so, of course, Canada ends up being, one of the big losers here. It's sort of a lose-lose situation. The U.S. has been able to, for example, sanction Huawei, put Huawei on the entity list without having any testimony from Meng Wanzhou. So it's not clear what benefit extraditing her to the U.S., for example, would be to the U.S. case against Huawei. And so, in the meantime, of course, we have this tragic situation where we have Canadians in jail in China, and we have, China-Canada relations in a bit of a difficulty. So I think the problem is generally within the Trump administration is some of the decision making and the strategy around these issues like 5G, around Huawei, are not well articulated, and so there are decisions that are made without sort of considering the second and third order effects of these. And unfortunately, this is what we have here that's occurred. And I think it's in everybody's interest to find a way out of this because it's really, again, it's a lose-lose situation for everybody, and it complicates all these other issues around, determining for Canada determining how to use Huawei and 5G, and it makes the discussion just that much more hard.
Margaret, let me get you to start off another subject for discussion here, namely, Donald Trump in the United States has had his approach in dealing with the Chinese government. He tends to get very bellicose at times, and I'm sure he believes that it's paying off in dividends for the way he practices foreign policy. Canada's approach has been to take a much more muted, quieter, behind-the-scenes approach. We got a new foreign affairs minister now. Chrystia Freeland is not on this anymore. François-Philippe Champagne is our new foreign affairs minister, a name that will, I suspect, resonate not at all with our viewers in the province of Ontario. He's a Quebec-based politician. Do we have any expectation that he's going to handle things any differently than his predecessor?
Well, he was trade minister, and he has a long career in international business. So he's very strong on that aspect of our relationship with China. And I think he's going to need to prove his bona fides on the diplomacy side. And we have an opportunity now to start a new discussion with China, to do a reset of the relationship. We have a period of time until Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor are charged. They haven't yet been charged, they've just been arrested. So they still haven't seen lawyers almost a year later. And so we have a period of time, could be next month, it could be 6 months from now, when they might be charged. And we should be really focused on working with other countries to put pressure on China, saying that this is their international reputation that's being tainted. China cares a lot about international face, and it's instructed us to stop working with other countries, so we know that we're hitting a home there. It's also instructed us to make a decision that's positive for Huawei. It's instructed us to stop talking about rule of law. It's instructed us to tone down the media, because the media is too negative on China these days in Canada. So these are the kinds of messages we're getting from the Chinese government. This is a whole world different than we were a year ago. So we have an opportunity now. If the Michaels are charged, I think we should start to take much more overt action to the extent we can in other countries to show China some consequences for its actions. Right now, they've seen no consequences to all the harm they've done to our tourism.
What can we do?
Well, I think we could name China under Magnitsky. We have a Magnitsky law that allows us to name officials of other countries that take action against human rights of our citizens, which is definitely what's happened with Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. Michael Kovrig being a diplomat, and so what they've been doing is against the Vienna Convention, interviewing him on his time as a diplomat. We could do other things like withdraw from the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. We could do things that would be more figurative, like sending back the pandas, because those are signs of friendship, and China is not being very friendly towards us.
How about arresting one of theirs?
So we would never do such a thing.
Should we?
Yeah, no, we shouldn't. No. Madam Meng was arrested on completely legally on the basis of some evidence, and so she will be able to make her case in court, and perhaps she'll win in court. Ours is a very, very fair judicial system.
Greg, let me pick this up with you. If you could whisper into the ear of the new Foreign Affairs Minister of Canada, how would you tell him to approach things?
I would tell them a couple of things. One, when we intervene, when we speak up, let's make sure we can be effective. And so far, I don't see what we've done the last year as being very effective. And maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe in time things will work out for us, but right now things don't look like they're in a very good state of affairs. The other thing I would say is that I think for Canada, I guess one of the things I'm worried about is I look 10, 20 years down the road and I think about questions of Canada's sovereignty. Do we have the space in this world of toughening geopolitics and great power rivalry? Will we be able to have some space where, of course, we have our important allies? The United States is a very important ally to us, but where we also have some room to make some sovereign decisions that are in Canada's national interests. And I'm concerned about sovereignty. I'm also concerned about how we're thinking about our national security. I think post 9/11, Five Eyes Network, it was very clear how things, what we should be doing when we're facing off against terrorism. But in this world now that we're now moving into, where things are becoming more multipolar and fractured and complicated, how to think through, our role within the Five Eyes network and, how the Five Eyes network should be operating. And then the last thing about growth, Canadian growth, long term. And I'm not saying that we should sacrifice sovereignty or our national security for growth, but Canadians care about their quality of life. And I think this idea that, with the way the world economy is changing, we often, I think, have been taking positions where we're trying to isolate China on certain things, by working with other allies to kind of shame China. I'm not sure that strategy is necessarily going to work. I wonder long term whether, if we keep going in this way, whether we're going to end up in Fortress North America and where we become isolated over the long term.
Richard.
I take your point, but 2 points from me. I don't think President Xi gets up in the morning and worries about Canada. So I think we have to be realistic. Our leverage with China is extraordinarily limited. I don't disagree with what Margaret was saying about doing a variety of things, but we need to be realistic. I think the biggest risk today is that the world is changing so fast, there's so much instability, amplified, if Paul will forgive me, by his president's approach to foreign relations, but he didn't create it, he didn't start it. I don't think we've come to grips yet with a new China and a new Russia. Different category, but equally problematic. We have instability rampant everywhere, and I certainly don't want to find myself in Fortress North America, but I'm beginning to wonder that if in practical terms we're not going to find ourselves in something like a spheres of influence again, where China is very, very influential, if not powerful, in Asia. We have what is euphemistically called the West, protecting its interests fairly broadly. And then we have Russia trying to muck about in its backyard and slightly beyond. That's not an ideal situation. I think globalization of travel, trade, capital, and everything else was a wonderful thing. But I think we have to realize the world has substantively changed, and we have 2 or 3 really significant adversaries. And I think one of the biggest problems in Canada in terms of coming to grips with this is we don't really feel threatened. We have 3 oceans in the United States, and short of a kinetic event, we sort of say, well, we'll chug along. And I think to some degree, that's why we're having difficulty coming to grips with the current difficulties we're having with China. We're not used to this. That's not anybody's fault. I don't think Mr. Harper's government would have done any better than Mr. Trudeau's in dealing with this. But I think we have to appreciate that the world has changed. I'm not sure the category of middle power really applies as much as it used to. We're going to have to rethink how we develop, coalitions of the willing and whatnot. And I think the government's been trying to do that, but I'm not sure they've been doing it consciously across the full range of our activities, not in terms of dealing with China. It was suggested earlier that we need a coherent Chinese policy. I was a public servant for 40-odd years, 20 of which I've spent in this general area, and I saw quite a few governments in their platforms and in government say, we need a China policy. None of them have succeeded, not for lack of trying, but in part because of the statistics you put up initially. There's a real division of view in Canada about where China falls. Is it the worst thing since the Black Plague or the best thing since sliced bread, to use idiotic expressions? But we really do have a division on this, and it's reflected in governments and parliaments and whatnot. So I think we need to do more thinking, but realizing that we're not going to do a heck of a lot alone.
Let me take, Hall, I've literally got 20 seconds to go, and we're not beyond taking advice from smart Americans up here in Canada. So care to give us any as to how we should proceed?
Well, I think the U.S. approach has been pretty good in the trade realm, but the problem has been that it hasn't been as multilateral as it could be to bring to bear greater pressure on China to open markets and to reduce subsidies and that kind of thing. So I think the problem right now in the U.S. is it's sort of it's U.S. Make America great again, and I think one of the challenges is that the approaches to China need to be multilateral. The Europeans, of course, are heavily engaged in these debates, but they have a similar approach to Canada. They don't see China necessarily as an existential threat, and so they're grappling with how do you deal with a rising China, a rising technology power, and trying to come up with ways to address critical issues around national security, but also maintain those economic relationships and other beneficial aspects, so we don't get into that world that was just Richard described earlier of Fortress America and Fortress Europe and a real breakdown of globalization. Nobody really, I think, benefits from that. Understood.
That's Paul Triolo in Washington, D.C. We thank Gregory Chin, Margaret McQuaig-Johnston, and Richard Fadden as well for joining us tonight on TVO. Thanks so much, everybody, for a great discussion.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.